Lebuh Pantai is one of the most familiar streets in Georgetown, Penang. Banks, offices, heritage buildings and cafes line the road, while traffic moves along what appears to be an ordinary city street. But there is something rather strange about its name, Beach Street, because the beach is no longer here. In fact, for much of its early history, the city came almost right up to this strait. What we know today as Lebuh Pantai began as a road along the eastern shoreline of Georgetown's promontory. Its position was not accidental. It was precisely because the sea was here that this would become one of the most important streets in Penang. When Captain Francis Light established the British settlement here in 1786, he was not creating a city in the middle of nowhere. Penang was already part of a busy maritime world. Ships moved through the Straits of Malacca. Traders from the Malay archipelago, India, China and elsewhere were already familiar with the island and the surrounding waters. Light's opportunity was to turn this strategically located harbour into a British trading settlement. The location chosen at the island's northeastern tip offered two crucial advantages: access to the sea and relatively low land where a town could be laid out. Very quickly, the beginnings of Georgetown took shape. Among the earliest streets were Light Street and Beach Street, together with Julius Street and Pitt Street. They formed the basic framework around which the young settlement would grow. At this point, Beach Street was very different from the street we know today. There were no grand banks, no imposing neoclassical buildings, no rows of honoured shophouses. The young settlement was modest, and many of its earliest buildings were made from timber and atap. But its greatest asset was immediately beside it, the harbour. For a merchant arriving by sea, Beach Street was not merely a road. It was the edge of the town and the place where the commercial world of Georgetown met the ships that connected Penang to the wider region. And that relationship between street and sea would shape the history of Lebuh Pantai for almost a century. Imagine standing here around 200 years ago. On one side, the young town, on the other, the sea. A boat could approach the shoreline, cargo could be brought ashore, and within moments it was moving into the commercial life of Georgetown. That simple geography gave Beach Street an enormous advantage. And as Penang's free port economy expanded, merchants followed. The road gradually changed from the edge of a small settlement into the commercial spine of a growing port. But the most dramatic transformation of all was still to come, because eventually the sea itself would be pushed away from Beach Street, and when that happened, the street would lose its beach but gain an entirely new city beside it. Within just a few decades of its founding, the little settlement established by Captain Francis Light in 1786 had changed dramatically. Georgetown was growing, and its growth was being driven by trade. The British had deliberately made Penang a free port, allowing merchants to trade with relatively few restrictions. That policy attracted ships, capital, and people from across the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea. And Beach Street was perfectly positioned to benefit. The shoreline provided access to the harbour, while the road connected the waterfront with the rest of Georgetown. Commerce naturally gravitated here. The people arriving in Georgetown were remarkably diverse. Chinese merchants established themselves alongside Indian Muslim traders, Malay traders, Armenians, Europeans, and others drawn to the opportunities of the port. They did not all conduct the same kind of business. Some dealt in textiles, others traded spices, rice, opium, timber, ceramics, metals, and provisions. Some specialize in shipping and agency work, connecting Penang with ports across the region. The street became a meeting place between different commercial worlds, and the Chinese presence would become particularly important. Chinese merchants and laborers were arriving in increasing numbers, establishing businesses and forming networks that connected Penang with southern China, the Malay states, and the wider maritime world. The physical landscape of Beach Street began changing as well. Simple houses gave way to more substantial commercial buildings. Warehouses and godowns appeared beside the road, providing somewhere to store goods before they were loaded onto ships or sent inland. The street was becoming an enormous marketplace without necessarily looking like one. Goods arrived by sea. They were unloaded, weighed, stored, and sold. Then they left again, heading to another port. Behind every transaction were merchants, clerks, boatmen, laborers, accountants, and shipping agents. Beach Street was becoming a machine for moving goods. By the middle of the 19th century, Beach Street was no longer a peripheral road at the edge of Georgetown. It was becoming one of the town's principal commercial arteries, and there was another development taking place just inland. Georgetown's famous shophouses were beginning to give the town a distinctive architectural character. The familiar combination of shop and residence allowed merchants to conduct business on the ground floor while living above. Covered walkways protected pedestrians from the tropical sun and rain. The street was becoming denser, more permanent, and increasingly prosperous. But the prosperity of Beach Street depended on something that could not remain unchanged forever: the sea. As Georgetown expanded, more land was needed. The solution was to reclaim the waterfront. Bit by bit, the shoreline moved eastward. New ground was created between Beach Street and the sea, allowing the town to expand towards the harbour. The change was profound. The street that had once stood directly beside the water was now separated from it. Beach Street had lost its beach, but commercially it was about to become more important than ever, because the newly created land would eventually accommodate roads, warehouses, offices, railway facilities, and other infrastructure serving the port. The old shoreline was disappearing, and in its place, a new Georgetown was emerging. By the end of the 19th century, Beach Street had become almost synonymous with commerce in Georgetown. Its buildings housed trading companies, shipping agents, importers, exporters, and merchants. The harbour remained close by, even if the sea was no longer immediately beside the road. And the street was becoming more sophisticated. This was no longer the rough waterfront of the early settlement. It was the commercial face of a prosperous port city. But the merchants who had made their fortunes here were about to create something even more ambitious. They would bring banks, insurance companies, and international corporations to Beach Street. And that would transform the street once again from a merchant's marketplace into the financial center of Penang. By the beginning of the 20th century, Beach Street had become one of the most important commercial streets in Georgetown. The humble waterfront road of the 1780s had disappeared. In its place stood a dense urban street lined with trading houses, offices, banks, and warehouses. And the fortunes being made here were no longer merely local. Penang had become part of a vast commercial network stretching across Southeast Asia, India, China, and Europe. Rubber, tin, spices, rice, and other commodities passed through its port, and Beach Street was where much of that commerce was organized. Behind these facades were businesses that connected Penang to the wider world. A trading house might have agents in Singapore, Bangkok, Rangoon, Calcutta, and Hong Kong. A merchant could buy goods in one port, arrange shipping from another, secure insurance in Georgetown, and sell the cargo somewhere thousands of kilometers away. The people working here needed more than warehouses. They needed banks, they needed insurance, they needed shipping companies, they needed lawyers, accountants, brokers, and telegraph officers, and Beach Street increasingly provided all of them. The arrival of banking institutions changed the character of the street. International banks established branches in Georgetown to serve the growing commercial economy. Money could be transferred, loans could be arranged, bills could be discounted, companies could secure cargo and finance new ventures. Beach Street was becoming something more than a place where goods were bought and sold. It was becoming the place where capital itself moved. And this is one reason why so many important commercial buildings appeared along the street. Their architecture projected confidence. Large entrances, imposing facades, and grand offices announced that serious business was being conducted inside. There was another technology quietly transforming commercial life: the telegraph. For centuries, merchants had depended on ships to carry news. Now, messages could cross the region in a fraction of the time. A merchant on Beach Street could receive information about prices, cargoes, and markets far beyond Penang. The port was becoming faster, and Beach Street was becoming its nerve center. But a street does not become a commercial center simply because banks and trading houses move in. It requires people, thousands of them, merchants and clerks, boatmen and coolies, rickshaw pullers and shopkeepers, policemen, messengers, accountants and laborers, Chinese, Indians, Malays, Europeans, and many others. Each had a role, but together they created the energy of Beach Street. And if we could step into this photograph, we could hear a remarkable mixture of languages and accents. Chinese dialects, Malay, Tamil, English, and the sound of a port city at work. From above, the transformation was even more obvious. The little settlement beside the sea had become a city, and Beach Street sat at the heart of it. The street had begun at the edge of Georgetown. Now it was one of the places from which Georgetown's commercial life was directed. But prosperity was never guaranteed. The very international economy that had made fortunes on Beach Street could also bring uncertainty. Prices could collapse, markets could change, and in the decades ahead, a much greater shock would arrive: war. By the 1920s, Beach Street had become a world of its own. The buildings were impressive, the businesses were prosperous, but the real character of the street came from the people who filled it. From early morning, merchants and clerks arrived at their offices. Deliveries came by cart. Rickshaw pullers waited for passengers. Workers carried goods between warehouses and shops, and increasingly another machine was beginning to compete for space on the road: the motor car. Beach Street was entering the modern age. For many people, the easiest way to cross Georgetown was by rickshaw. The rickshaw puller did the walking for you. Hundreds of these men worked across the city, and the rickshaw became one of the unmistakable sounds and sights of old Georgetown. A passenger might arrive at a bank on Beach Street, cross the road to a trading house, then continue to the market or railway station, all without walking by far. The street was compact, but it was intensely busy. The businesses on Beach Street also competed for attention in another way: through advertising. Newspapers carried announcements for trading companies, shipping agents, banks, insurance firms, hotels, and shops. Their advertisements tell us something important. Beach Street was not serving only Penang. It was serving a regional economy. A company based here might advertise its ability to import goods from Europe, arrange shipping to the Malay Peninsula, or connect merchants with markets across Asia. The street's importance extended far beyond its physical length. Even a business directory reveals the density of commercial life. Trading firms, shipping agents, banks, insurance companies, law offices, exporters, importers, and businesses serving their businesses. This was one of the great strengths of Beach Street. Everything a merchant needed could be found within a relatively small area. The street functioned almost like a commercial ecosystem, and at its center were the people who had built fortunes through Penang's port economy. Among them were Chinese merchants whose businesses had become deeply woven into the economy of Penang. Some families had been trading here for generations. Their companies could deal in rice, textiles, tin, rubber, shipping, and imported goods, and their networks extended well beyond Penang. Business was built not simply on capital, but on relationships. A merchant's reputation mattered. So did family connections, dialect networks, and partnerships across the region. Behind the elegant facades of Beach Street was a sophisticated commercial society. And Beach Street did not necessarily fall silent when the offices closed. The lights came on. People continued moving through Georgetown. Restaurants and shops stayed open. Rickshaws carried passengers home. The commercial district remained connected to the wider life of the city. For more than a century, Beach Street had adapted to one transformation after another. From shoreline to commercial road, from merchant houses to banks and corporate offices, from carts and sailing vessels to motorcars and telegraphs. It seemed almost unstoppable. But the next transformation would not be driven by commerce or technology. It would be driven by war. In the years immediately before the Second World War, Beach Street still appeared confident. The banks were opened. The trading houses were busy, ships continued to arrive at Penang, and the street remained one of the commercial centers of Georgetown. Then, in December 1941, the war reached Penang. Japanese aircraft began bombing the island. The confidence of the colonial city disappeared remarkably quickly. The bombing caused panic. Civilians fled the city. The British military position on Penang deteriorated rapidly, and the decision was made to withdraw. On 19 December 1941, Japanese forces entered Georgetown. There was no great battle for the city. Instead, British rule simply collapsed. For the people of Beach Street, the world they knew had changed almost overnight. The Japanese occupation transformed everyday life. The British administration disappeared. Businesses were subjected to new controls. The currency changed. Food became scarce, and fear became part of daily life. For Penang's Chinese population, the occupation was especially traumatic. The Japanese military extended the Sukching Purge from Singapore into the Malay Peninsula, and Penang's Chinese population was subjected to mass screening in April 1942. Those identified as anti-Japanese or simply regarded as suspect were detained, and many were subsequently executed. Thousands across Penang were killed. It is a dark chapter in the history of the island, and one that cannot be separated from the history of the street. Because Beach Street was not an isolated commercial enclave, it was part of the city in which these people lived, worked, and suffered. But commerce could not simply disappear. The Japanese froze existing bank accounts and introduced their own currency. Yet the economy still needed to function. Local banks were eventually permitted to reopen under Japanese control. One of them was Ban Hin Lee Bank, which operated from 43 Beach Street during the occupation. The Overseas Chinese Banking Corporation also operated from Beach Street during these years. It was a strange and precarious continuation of the old commercial world. The banks were still there, the buildings were still there, but the economic system that had made Beach Street prosperous had been fundamentally disrupted. Towards the end, the war became still more destructive. In 1944 and 1945, Allied aircraft bombed Japanese naval and administrative targets in Georgetown. Some historic buildings were damaged or destroyed. Among the casualties were parts of the old government offices. What remains standing today houses the Majlis Agama Islam Pulau Pinang. The destruction from war would permanently alter the streetscape, and some of the records of colonial and wartime administration disappeared with the buildings themselves. Beach Street has survived fires, economic crises, and decades of change, but the Second World War left scars that could not be simply repaired. Then, in August 1945, Japan surrendered. On 3rd September, British Royal Marines landed at Swettenham Pier. Georgetown was liberated. For the people of Beach Street, it was the beginning of another uncertain chapter. The old colonial order was returning, but the world of 1939 could not be restored. The war had changed Penang. It had changed its people, and it had changed the meaning of the street itself. Beach Street had entered the 20th century as the symbol of commercial confidence. It would emerge from the war into a very different age. After the war, Beach Street had to begin again. The buildings were still standing, the businesses were reopening, and once again merchants and clerks returned to their offices. But the old confidence had gone. The war had disrupted international trade, damaged the businesses, and shaken the colonial system that had governed Penang for more than a century and a half. A new era was approaching, and Beach Street would have to find its place in it. The physical appearance of Georgetown was changing too. Motor vehicles were increasingly common. Buses and taxis joined the traffic. New businesses appeared while some of the old trading houses disappeared. The city was becoming more modern and increasingly less dependent on the waterfront economy that had created Beach Street. For generations, the street's importance had come from its position beside the port. But the center of gravity of the city was beginning to shift. Then came a moment that changed the political landscape of the country. On 31st August 1957, Malaya became independent. The Union Jack was lowered. A new national flag flew over a country beginning to govern itself. For Beach Street, independence did not erase the past. The old banks remained. The old merchant houses remained. The buildings themselves had no nationality, but the society around them was changing. Georgetown was no longer a colonial port. It was becoming a Malaysian city. The port itself was changing. Cargo handling was becoming increasingly mechanized. Ships were becoming larger. Road transport was becoming more important. And the waterfront that had once been dominated by small sailing crafts and labor-intensive loading operations was entering the modern age. The old relationship between Beach Street and the sea was weakening further. The street remained commercially important, but it was no longer the indispensable gateway to Penang that it had once been. By the 1960s, the change was becoming unmistakable. The grand commercial houses of an earlier generation were aging, some businesses survived, others moved elsewhere, and newer commercial centers were emerging as Georgetown expanded. Beach Street was no longer the only place where businesses happened. The street had lost something of its old dominance, but it had gained something else: age. And with age came a new question. What should be done with the buildings and streets that carry the memory of Georgetown's past? By the 1970s, Beach Street looked increasingly like a street from another era. The architecture was still there, but the world that had created it was fading. New cars moved beneath old facades. Modern businesses occupied historic premises. Some buildings were carefully maintained. Others were beginning to show their age. Yet this aging cityscape would soon acquire a new value. People were beginning to realize that Georgetown's old streets were not simply obstacles to modernization. They were part of the city's identity. And that changing attitude would eventually help save Beach Street from disappearing beneath the pressures of redevelopment. The transformation was slow, but the attitude towards Georgetown's historic buildings was changing. Conservationists, historians, and residents increasingly recognized that the old commercial streets represented something irreplaceable. The buildings were not merely old. Together, they told the story of how Georgetown had grown from a small port settlement into a cosmopolitan city. Beach Street was part of that story, and so instead of being swept away by the modern city, its historic buildings increasingly became something to preserve. The city was entering yet another chapter, not as the commercial powerhouse it had once been, but as a heritage street whose greatest asset was its past. By the 1980s, Beach Street had become something different. It was no longer the center of Penang's commercial universe. The port economy had changed, businesses had moved, and the modern city had grown well beyond the compact streets of old Georgetown. But something remarkable had happened. The buildings remained, the street remained, and increasingly people began to see these old structures not as relics to be replaced, but as part of Penang's heritage. The change was not instantaneous. Conservation took time. Some buildings were restored carefully, others were adapted for new users, and some remained stubbornly weathered, carrying the marks of decades of commercial life. This was not the creation of a historical theme park. It was an old city adapting to new circumstances. And that distinction would become important, because the value of Georgetown's heritage was not simply in preserving beautiful facades. It was in preserving a living city. Then came a milestone that changed the way the world looked at Georgetown. On 7 July 2008, Georgetown was inscribed, together with Malacca, on the UNESCO World Heritage List. UNESCO recognized the two cities as exceptional examples of historic trading towns shaped by centuries of cultural exchange between East and West. Georgetown's historic core includes more than 1,700 historic buildings, with Lebuh Pantai among its principal streets. The inscription gave international recognition to something Penang residents had long known. These streets mattered, not simply because they were old, but because they preserved evidence of the people, cultures, and commerce that had shaped the city. Today, Beach Street is known as Lebuh Pantai, and it is once again a busy Georgetown street. But look carefully, and the layers of its history are still visible. The shophouses remain, the old commercial buildings remain, the 5-footways remain, and behind the modern businesses are buildings that once housed merchants, banks, shipping companies, and trading firms. The street has changed its purpose many times, but it has never stopped being a place of business. Stand here long enough, and the past begins to overlap with the present. The rickshaws are gone, the horse carts are gone, the coolies carrying cargo along the waterfront are gone. The sea that once came almost to the street is now hidden beyond a broad belt of reclaimed land. And yet, some of the buildings are still standing in almost the same places. They have witnessed the arrival of the motorcar, the Japanese occupation, the end of British rule, independence, the transformation of Penang's economy, and the rebirth of Georgetown as a heritage city. And perhaps that is the most remarkable thing about Lebuh Pantai. Its name is a reminder of the landscape that no longer exists. Beach Street. The beach has disappeared. The shoreline has moved. The port has changed. The merchants have changed. The businesses have changed. The city itself has changed. But the street remains. For more than 2 centuries, Lebuh Pantai has watched Georgetown transform from a small settlement beside the sea into a cosmopolitan port, a colonial city, a Malaysian city, and now a World Heritage City. And if you walk along it today, you are not simply walking through an old street. You are walking through the history of Georgetown itself.